Welcome back, everyone. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about the experience that I had last week when I got a day to shoot with the Sony A9 II, which was pretty amazing. So last week, I went up to PhotoPlus in New York City. If you're not familiar with PhotoPlus, it's an annual trade show convention thing that they do in New York City for the photo industry, and all the big camera companies will have booths at this thing. Except this year, Sony actually pulled out of the trade show and did their own thing, like down the street, which is pretty brilliant. So essentially, they leased out SAR Studios, which is a legendary space. This is where like bands rehearsed to go on tour. They rented out this entire space and they built it out with sets and different lighting and different places where you could shoot. They had athletes, they had dancers, there was all kinds of stuff to do there. And before I went up, one of my contacts over at Sony actually said, well, why don't you come over on Tuesday, because we're doing a thing with press photographers. So they invited a lot of people who shoot sports, who shoot for the press, and had them come out to get a chance to shoot with the A9. And I got an opportunity to shoot on it as well. It was pretty interesting. There were some amazing photographers there. It was really fun to meet and talk to some of these guys. And I had some experience with the camera. And now I want to talk about this a little bit because I think it's really interesting. When the original A9 came out, this was Sony's flagship, still is. And I've had a lot of experience shooting on the original A9 over the last 2 years or so. I've had the opportunity with Sony to shoot sports events. I've had the opportunity to shoot wildlife. I've used it for just general purpose photography. And I've always been a huge fan of the original A9. Now, when the A9 II was announced recently, I did my PR press video on that. And I was really kind of surprised at the reaction that I got. A lot of people expected more camera from Sony. And to be honest with you, I just kind of had a press briefing with them and they gave me the specs. And all I knew is that the camera was a little bit faster and there were some autofocus improvements. When I actually got to get hands-on with this camera, my God, it was impressive. So this camera will adjust autofocus and exposure 60 times per second. The top shooting speed is 20 frames a second. So essentially, it will adjust autofocus and exposure 3 times for every image that you're able to take when you're doing the spray and pray thing, which I will be really honest, that's not really my style of photography. It's very useful if you're shooting sports, but in my general use, I'm not a bunch of shots type of guy unless it's something that really is specific. But what I love about both the original A9 and the A9 II is that it's such a fast camera and the autofocus and auto exposure are so on top of things that really you don't come back with any blown shots. And this totally opens it up to you as a photographer to do what you want to do with composition and with lighting, and it really is just, it's an amazing camera. And the A9 II, it's hard to put it into words, it's even better. And I didn't think I would notice much of a difference because when I looked at the press release and the specs on this camera, it looked to me like networking capabilities were the big draw here. The only really technical improvement was a 10 frames per second mechanical shutter rate as opposed to 5 on the original A9, which is really nice to have. It uses electronic shutter when you're up at 20 frames a second. But I was really blown away. In fact, my friend Byron and I have this running joke that, oh, I have a shot this afternoon I got to take, but the camera's in my bag. It's already focused and ready to go. I mean, it really was like that. It's like you really didn't even feel this thing kicking into gear. You have visual feedback inside the viewfinder with the green box that tells you where your focus is, and it's just so accurate. And I get home, and I did some high-speed continuous shooting. I did some single shots, and literally, like, everything is on. Like, there's bad shots, and the only reason they're bad shots is because it's my fault, not the cameras. Like, nothing's out of focus, nothing's off exposure. It really is unbelievably good. The other thing that I really liked about it was the ergonomics. Now, I did the press trip this year for the Sony A7R IV, and I got a chance to use that camera, and I really like the improvements that they did on the body. You get a little bit thicker grip, some of the buttons are a little bit bigger, it just feels better as a camera. And I had not had a chance to use that body on a battery grip yet. The Sony Creative Space, I got a chance to use it with the grip, and this is ergonomically the best camera Sony has ever designed. It's really comfortable to use. It's not heavy, it's lightweight, it's fast. Well, you can see in a lot of these test shots how it just locks on the face, particularly the eyes. And I was using the 135mm f1.8. I'm pretty sure I was shooting this wide open, so it's a shallow depth of field, and I had no errors whatsoever. Which brings me to a point that I want to make about technology versus expectations. And I think this is actually something that's really interesting to see now. The first time I started using Sony cameras was back when they had the NEX series of cameras. cameras that were out. And if you look at the way technology has moved in the last, probably let's say 8 to 10 years, and back then mirrorless was kind of a new thing. It was Sony, it was Micro Four Thirds, so you had Olympus, you had Panasonic, you had Fujifilm that were starting to make cameras, and they were all taking this mirrorless approach, which at the time they were considered to be, well, if you take out the mirror box, it's a smaller camera. That was the only advantage that anybody saw. And what Sony have been able to leverage with stacked CMOS sensors, with being able to take a live data feed off of a sensor and do a lot with it, and I'm targeting Sony mainly because that's the subject of this video, but also the speed, and I think that's where Sony has made all of their gains, is like the speed of autofocus, the speed of what the camera can do with that live data that's coming off of the sensor and how that impacts how you can use the camera. And we've seen just literally leaps and bounds every year in terms of like, here's a brand new feature that we've never seen before, that we've never been able to do before. Video has become a major component in a lot of these cameras, and so now I think we're at a point where we started to kind of max out what we can do with the technology that we have in terms of hardware. And so it's going to be another year or two before we have a next gen of hardware that we're able to do more with. And so it's really interesting to see when we have an incremental update is what most people see it as. In other words, there's no blinding feature that never has happened before. It tends to be improvements on feature sets that we already have. And the way that's received, and when I did my preview video on the A9 II, I was really surprised to see a lot of the comments and a lot of the negativity that came out of it. And actually having used that camera now, I can guarantee you it is mind-blowingly good. I want to do a full review on that, and I'm going to wait till I have a camera to do that with. But I mean, it is unbelievably good. But I also think that there's a culture of expectations that come out, and this all comes from even the phone industry, where we are guaranteed to have a new model of phone from every manufacturer every year. And how can we keep up with that speed cycle? And this is where I kind of want to hear from you guys and what your thoughts are on this. I mean, I'm like everybody else. I look at the rumor sites. I want to know kind of what's being expected. You know, it's like kind of like trying to figure out what's under the tree before Christmas. I get it. It's fun. It's cool. But what's interesting to me is that knowing how these cameras are developed, a camera is not developed over a couple months. They usually have a development span of several years, and this is also a corporate culture where sometimes an initiative is launched and maybe it takes a turn and goes a different direction. So sometimes when a rumor leaks about something and it is reported, sometimes that path can change, and then when that expectation that the rumor has become is not met, there is disappointment. And so that's kind of an unfortunate side effect of the culture that we have now. But it's also interesting to me because I think that, you know, the customer expectation of what we want technology to do for us is really high. I mean, we've had a high bar for a long time, and that's not wrong. And I'll give you another example, like, you know, the Sony A7S. That's a camera that people are expecting some kind of Mark III to come out that's going to have this heavy video-centric skill set that it's able to do. Now, while I don't think that's a bad idea, you also have to remember that the original A7S was really never meant to be a video camera. It just did really low and low light, did really well in low light. The A7S, the S stands for sensitivity, and I can tell you because I own Sonys and I shoot on them that the A7 III that I'm using right now actually performs just as well in low light as my original A7S. And so what's the point of that line anymore? And again, what are we doing with the technology? Can the sensors actually be better in low light with what we have with hardware right now? And that's an interesting question. So the other thing that I want to say in Sony's defense that I think is actually really cool is it is a very bold move to pull out of a trade show and do your own event down the street. And in a corporate culture, I think that's extremely edgy and extremely good because, you know, when you go to a trade show, and I've been to PhotoPlus for a number of years now, you can see that every year the attendance is less and less and less. And I also know that it costs an astronomical sum of money to not only have a booth at one of these things, but also because it's union governed, just to bring your stuff in the door or get a power strip or redo the lights is just, you know, like moving a mountain. And so to pull out of that and to do your own space, it's not because you're defying what's there, it's because you're coming up with an experience that's better. And Sony are really good at that. I think it's particularly impressive for a corporate structure to be able to move like this. When you go to a trade show, normally you see all these tables at any given booth. I'm not knocking anybody, but the cameras and the lenses are all tethered to the table, and you don't really, I mean, it's like going to B&H or something on steroids. It's like you're not going to get any pictures or have a good feel for it. And in their defense, I think Fujifilm were really good this year too. They had a smaller booth. There was very little product out, but they had a little depot where you could go check out cameras and you could go on street photography walks and stuff that they had planned. And I think that's awesome because you're actually getting hands-on with the camera. What Sony did was they moved down the street. They rebranded this thing Creative Space NYC. Every time I walked by there was a line out the door and down the block. It was unbelievable. And they had a gear depot in there and you could check out lenses and cameras. And they do a lot of these B Alpha events, and what I would strongly suggest is if you have one in your area that they're doing, try to make time to go to that because it's going to allow you to get hands-on with some of these cameras, and you can actually come home and look at the images and decide for yourself. And rather than look at everything on this kind of grand scale of we're all keyboard warriors and we expected this, it's like, what is this actually doing? Because I was really impressed with the A9 II, and I'm kind of surprised that Sony didn't market that a little bit differently. But for whatever reason, maybe it's just hard to talk about incremental upgrades and talk about them in this grand sense. But this camera really is fantastic. I'd love to hear from you guys. We've covered a lot of ground, and I probably changed subjects in here somewhere, but I'll catch you guys in the next video. Until then, later.